All right, so we are now going to be discussing Chapter 2 of Decoding the Ethics Code, in which we'll be deciphering and gaining an understanding about how the applicability section as well as preamble and general principles affect us as psychologists. In looking at how we start to go about to understand the applicability as well as the preamble, the first thing we have to ask ourselves is, who does the ethic code affect in the first place? Realize that all APA members as well as student affiliates are going to be affected by this. But you also have to realize, even if you're not part of the American Psychological Association, you still can be impacted by the ethics code simply because the majority of many of the psychology boards within our country, as well as in Canada, go by the ethics code. Therefore, you might not be a member, but they can still influence whether or not you should be still licensed if you are violating the ethics codes. So know that it is adopted by the majority of the programs here in the United States, as well as Canada. And we have to go by those same laws and rules and regulations, just as if you was a member of APA. Now, when we're talking about the type of activities, what does it apply to in terms of the ethics code? These activities are going to include, but they're not only limited to, they're including clinical, the counseling, school practices, when you do research, myself as an instructor, or if I was doing supervision, it's going to be to cover public service, as well as any type of policies that's created, program designs, everything and anything that's involved in psychology you could consider to be applied with the ethic code in mind. So it's the majority of the work that we do. It has to have some type of regulations, and thus that ethic code applied to those as well. All right, so here we're talking about now looking at how exactly will it fit as far as a person. Now remember, as a psychologist, once you are a fully fledged psychologist, you're going to be aspiring, not only trying to follow the general principles, but you're going to also try to aspire to do well, to not harm others. You're going to want to make sure that you are acting accordingly, okay? So in terms of when we're talking about professional versus personal activity, no, the ethics code is not going to really apply to everything that you do as an individual person personally. But God forbid, say you get convicted of a crime, and it's a felony, yes, that will apply to your license, and in which it can be revoked because of it. If you are doing things that will impact your ability to be an effective psychologist, and it's kind of hard to give examples. The best example I can give, which is always the big picture within the ethics code in itself, is the type of relationships you'll hold. It's kind of where you need to make sure you shy away from those type of multiple relationships in which you'll have there's a possibility that you might manipulate inadvertently, or it could be on purpose. So, although we don't say that the ethics code is going to personally affect your individual life, as a psychologist, the things that you do that can impact your career, even if it's personal, still can have some impact. It's those type of situations that when it's muddy between professional and personal, in which it can seem ambiguous, but it might have that impact, particularly, like I said, if you're doing crimes or if you're dealing with relationships. And of course, we'll go into deeper discussion of those. All right, so continuing talking about professional versus the personal values. Our value systems, we're raised to think and believe in certain ways. We all do. How we're raised is going to be different from one person to the next. Our actions, and I'm going to read this directly, actions that are contrary to the ethics code can arise when psychologists apply their values that may be virtuous in personal relationships, but they apply it to those professional contexts in which those values might become harmful. Now, you might find yourself often being involved with this type of particular situation. I don't know about you, but no sooner than my family and friends learned that I was studying to become a psychologist, they wanted to immediately start asking me how to go about handling different situations in their life, in that they wanted me to try to fix them, especially my younger sister, my stepsister. She used to get on my last nerve. I would tell her, I cannot do that. Ethically, it's wrong because I know you too well. So, one thing you'll have to always put within understanding, I give a rule to all family and friends. I immediately share with them that I cannot provide therapy to you because we're too close. And it's a hard thing to sell for people because they immediately want to get your thoughts and have you tell them how to live their lives, pretty much. I no longer give advice to others because they could take that as meaning I was trying to provide therapy. So you have to really become stringent in and become very selective in how you approach friends and family. One of the things I found to be where a new person meets you, my husband, he had this bad habit of constantly telling people what I did for a living. And I would say, please don't do that. So you don't understand exactly what's going to happen once you tell people that, ooh, my wife's a psychologist. Well, he learned after a while because no sooner than he would introduce me to friends of his and they hear I'm a psychologist, the next thing I'm hearing is their whole life story and they want me to do an assessment. And I'm like, no. And I cut them off. It's important for us to understand that how we handle ourselves and our value systems can impact that next person, okay? Be that in your professional relationships as well as your personal relationships. In your professional relationships, you have to be careful not to take what you feel you think is right and impose it on your client. You have to always remain objective. And this is what this particular piece on this slide is discussing. They're talking about how we have our own value systems in place already. But we need to make sure that we're working through evidence-based theory when we utilize our techniques and tools when we're working with a client. And so that can become very difficult and extremely hard, even when you're working professionally. I found myself early in my career working out at Mississippi State Hospital. I had this one client that I really did find myself growing attached to in the sense of trying to instill what I thought was the appropriate things that they should learn. This person was intellectually challenged, and I'm a mother. I got that mother-like feelings going on. And through supervision, I was able to work through it. But it's not that hard to slip in and fall into your own belief systems. So you want to make sure that you're really careful when you are working um, and to avoid, because it is a way that you can inadvertently instill your thoughts and values in terms of how a client should be, and that's not our job. I always express and explain to my clients or patients to consider me not telling you what to do, because that's what they always want you to do, but to express that I am just a guide of what you send to me. I'm becoming a mirror. And hopefully you're going to see what you need that's going to help you in order for you to come up with the answers yourself. I never allow a client to think that I'm going to tell you what to do, because that's not my job. My job is to be able to guide a client into being able to gain insight into the situation at hand for them, and for them to be able to learn how to do problem solving on their own. I only provide the mirror. It's, if you think about like the empty chair technique, in which you have them talk it out, think of yourself as being that empty chair in terms of allowing the person to be able to provide you the information, and you being able to reflect that back through reframing to allow them to hear what they're saying, and hopefully they gain insight into the issues at hand. So that's what we're speaking about when we're talking about trying to understand how our professional versus personal values interplay, and how ethics is an uh, important part of the equation. So, and I guess I jumped the gun in some of the last slide, but displacing personal values with narrow interpretations on specific ethical standards can lead to thoughtless or unethical responses within the context of those complex moral issues encountered by psychologists. Again, it's not about you. You have to always remember, as a therapist, it's not about what you think or feel. It's about what your client is there for. I can tell you millions of stories that I've gained through the years. One that stays within my mind that had me teetering, tottering ethically was working with a sex predator, in which they was full-fledged, and I still struggle even talking about it right now in terms of how to work with this individual. I was angry with them. And at some point, I discovered I found myself allowing my anger and allowing myself my personal feelings, because it was a child molester, and my personal feelings because I'm a mother, was starting to influence therapy more than my uh, education as a psychologist. I wanted them to feel the pain that they put onto others. Thankfully, I discovered that. That's why I tell you it's extremely important, and we'll talk more in terms of how we talk about supervision. The need to be able to consult with not only just your supervisor, but with other colleagues, providing they're talking about your thought process, because it's a thin line into which you'll find yourself putting yourself more into it than your craft, so to speak, than utilizing that evidence-based theories. So you want to really be careful in terms of that. And I had to discover and found that when we talk about sexual predators and such, that was my limitation. I could not continue working with that individual, because that was one area, no matter how hard I tried, I always found myself having to jump back and not impose my personal feelings. So one thing I do want to share with you, that no, you don't want to just throw clients to the curb. We don't abandon clients, okay? But we do have to understand and be aware of our limitations. That's extremely important. When you know that you can easily cross the line and impose your value system, and no matter what you do, you continuously do that, then ethically speaking, you are obligated to locate and find someone that's going to be better suited for your client. One problem we found that we see people might be real ready, just because they look funny or seem funny, that they automatically want to refer them out. That's not what I'm speaking about. I can give you an example, which every time I tell this story, students really, their minds get boggled. During graduate school, and I was doing what y'all do as far as when you're in externship, I had the pleasure of working with someone who classified himself as a skinhead. And the first day he came in for treatment, and he came on his own accord because he was dealing with anger issues. But the first time he came in, he walked in the room, he saw me, and he said, "Oh, I'm not going to be around the N-word." Okay, of course, I got, whoo, I became agitated. And I was just ready to dump him to the next person, quite frankly. I was like, there's no way I'm going to deal with this. I went straight to my supervisor. I said, have a seat. Let's see what we could do to help you out, because I don't want to be here if you don't want me here. Went straight to my supervisor, and thankfully he was there that day at the clinic. Sat down with him, and he's like, don't you have a client right now? And I was like, yeah, but this client, he is a racist. He is a white supremacist. He called me the N-word several times. He cussed me out. I am not the right person for him. My supervisor asked me, why? Why are you not the right person for him? And I said, well, he don't like black people. That's why. And he's like, okay, but is it only because he don't like black people or because you don't like him? And I said, well, I didn't care for how he treated me. And he kept talking with me. He said, okay. He said, we can get we can get someone else for him if you think that's best. But I have to ask you one question. And I said, what's that? He said, who's therapy for? Who's the one being provided therapy? And I said, he is. He said, so then why can't you provide the therapy to him? He said, perhaps working with you, he may learn other things about himself. I sat there for about a good 2-3 minutes silent, processed what he said, and then I said, okay, it's not about me. It's about helping the client, regardless of what their situation is. So I went back in the room and I shared with the client. I said, look, at this point you've been assigned to me. I do understand that you do not care for me as a person. However, did you come here for help? And he said yes. I was like, well, regardless of what you're feeling because of the color of my skin, do you think you can take time and let's just talk for a little while and see if I can actually help you with something? He was open to it. So we spent the next 50 minutes and I did a clinical interview and I started establishing a rapport. That work continued for 6 months thereafter. And he came through to a lot of discovery. Am I going to say that when he walked away from therapy, when he finally finished and we terminated sessions, that he was no longer a racist? No. But what I will say is that he allowed himself to open up to try to discover why he disliked black people in the first place. Where I was at for school, I was in the Midwest. He lived in an area where there really was no black people. So he used to come and drive down to the clinic. So he never really had experiences with black people before me. I say this in the sense of expressing to you that my value system could not play a part because if I allowed my belief systems and my values to influence me, we would never have been able to work together. Never. Because I despised everything he believed in. But I was able to take on the notion and understanding that it's not about me. When you are sitting across from a person, therapy is not about you. And when you find yourself involved in the sense of you wanting to push your value systems on a person, you are being unethical. So, with that being said, you do want to be aware of your limitations, but don't immediately be ready to push everything aside, because that's being unethical as well. All right, let's move on. All right, so looking at specific language that's going to be used within the ethics code, you'd have to make sure that you have an understanding about how to look at it in terms of noticing your own behaviors and how it relates to the ethics code. If your behaviors is kind of iffy and you know that what you're doing can be considered a violation, here's an example. A lot of people have difficulties in terms of dealing with plagiarism. Plagiarism is a big one, and a lot of times people don't realize just how easy it is to plagiarize. But if you know that you haven't provided full credit where credit is due, the language is simple in this aspect. Give credit to others. It's extremely important that, I don't care if you submit a paper where every other sentence is providing a reference. You are making sure that if you did not come up with the original idea, that you provide credit to where credit is due. So you have to have that clarity that's going to be necessary to provide adequate notice about your behaviors in consideration for code violations for yourself, but you have to also be able to see it for others. And if you're seeing others violating the ethics code, what do you think you need to be doing? What would be the first thing that you should do? And this is real difficult, particularly in academia. If you're seeing a violation, you need to approach that violation. If you're discussing and talking about, you see as somebody, for example, becoming, really close in a relationship, and they're a psychologist to, a client, then the first thing you should do is approach that psychologist. That's the first thing. And that's difficult. A lot of times people want to just kind of turn their head to this fact. But our roles and our responsibilities as psychologists is vast. And one of the things is we have to try to help to nip potential violations in the bud, so to speak. So if I'm seeing that someone is being unethical, my first step would be to approach that person and express to them, I noticed that you've been talking to this client and you're talking to them outside of the clinic, and it appears that, you might be getting close to this person, and I just want to share with you that it's being noticed and that you potentially have a violation, an unethical situation going on, and that it's my responsibility to at least share that with you. Now that person can say, you need to mind your business, and I didn't have to turn around and say, but this is my business. I have to be able to protect those who are coming to us for assistance. So it would be irresponsible and unethical of me to just ignore it. Once you give a person a warning, if they continue on, then the next step is that, we have to report that. So we want to make sure, though, that everything that we're doing is to be able to enhance and not kind of impede on psychology in itself. our practice is important. You don't want to be considered quacks. Okay? And once upon a time, psychology was considered to be not scientifically sound. We've gotten ourselves to the point where people trust us to be able to do no harm to others. If we're not following this ethics code, guess what? We'll return back to a time when we weren't taken seriously. And we have to, help those who struggle with it. Sometimes people don't realize that they are committing unethical acts. So you want to be able to make sure to share that when you see that. And a good way of doing that, when you go to approach somebody, you don't want to jam it to them. Just like when we want to approach, we want to make sure we de-escalate a situation. But also be prepared. Try to have which principles are being impacted so that you can share it with that person. And this way they can look it up for themselves and they can see, and hopefully it'll help encourage them to aspire to go above what they were doing. All right, so let's keep moving. Now, do notice, adjudicatory decisions are based on ethic codes can remain vulnerable to overturn on an appeal if defendants can argue they had no forewarning that specific behaviors were ethical violations. That's what I was just talking about. It's important for us to forewarn an individual that they are performing a particular violation. And when you don't, guess what? They can go back, if they are ever called to be in front of the committee, they can go and say, well, nobody told me that this was a violation. So what? Be sure that make sure you provide that due notice. If you find that, for example, God forbid, you thought that I was doing an unethical act, I would hope that you approach me. One of the biggest things and biggest issues, particularly when we're talking about in academia, students are afraid to approach and express if they think that their instructors or the faculty is doing unethical violations. It's their fear of retaliation. They're afraid that by saying something that it can impact them. So sometimes students will say, well, I'm just going to call APA. Under this ethics code, in reality, you are supposed to provide forewarning, even when you're afraid that it can impact you negatively. Can't guarantee that there won't be some form of retaliation. I can't guarantee that because, unfortunately, human nature exists and people will do things according to what they feel. Like I said, I have a lot of stories and a lot of examples. I worked in Texas Youth Commission for 6 months. Only 6 months. I was terminated. Reason for termination ultimately was because the superintendent of that facility was upset with me. They were upset with me because I did a psychological assessment on a teenager, and my report pretty much said that we shouldn't keep this teenager in the facility any longer because it is now negatively impacting the youth in terms of their behavior patterns. This youth came in when he was 12 years old. At the time of my assessment, he was 14 years old. And in Texas, kids get incarcerated because they called it a facility, but it was a juvenile prison, basically. And for this young man, when he was 12, he got put into the system for shoplifting. And yeah, 2 years later, he was still within the facility, and pretty much his behavior patterns had deteriorated. He was always in fights, always starting fights, a whole lot of negativity. And pretty much it's like, if you recall, what they call folie à deux for couples, in which the couple, one partner starts demonstrating and showing you the signs of the pathology of the other partner. Well, that was a similar instance for this young man. In order to protect himself, he started acting like everybody else. And he was given several disorders, actually. They said he had bipolar disorder. They gave him ADHD. He didn't have any of those things in doing the assessment with him. But behaviorally speaking, yeah, he had conduct disorder. But this conduct disorder was coming about based on a need for survival, so to speak. So my report reflected that. But it was during a time when the facility was being scrutinized, and there was a concern that the facility was going to be closed. And so the superintendent wanted to show the need for how we have to keep all of the youth that we have. And so the superintendent wanted me to change my report. And I refused. I said, I can't do that ethically. That's, that will be me influencing the fate of this young man, and it would be based off of a lie if I changed my report. Needless to say, the superintendent decided that she was going to assign it to someone else and make them do it, which they did, write the report the way she saw it. But the unfortunate thing was, she didn't realize I had already sent my report to Department of Justice, who gets all these reports and file them away anyway. So when a second report came in, of course it made her look bad, because they were like, okay, well, why is one psychologist saying this and another psychologist is saying that? And of course it was weird. Eventually they cleared it up and had it where that student was finally sent to a place that they can truly get some real help for their behavior problems. And my hope is, because of course I've lost contact with that youth, but hopefully it helped to straighten them out, because they were no longer in the environment that helped to produce those behavior patterns. But after that, my superintendent wasn't happy with me, and maybe a month after that all settled down, she tried to find a way to fire me. And she did fire me, actually. And I had to fight with the state of Texas and the Labor Department to clear my name, because she also had put me on the child abuse list. But the moral to this whole story is to express why it's important in terms of our ethical behavior. If I was acting unethical, no one forewarned me or was able to express exactly what violations I was demonstrating. But if I wanted to, which I did actually use the due notice, that there was no due notice and there was no ethical violations presented to me, and I expressed and explained the whole thing, which helped clear me up. But in documentation, always document everything you do. But to get back to our lesson for the day, be sure that when you approach someone, have the codes in place, be able to explain it, to allow them to have a chance to change their behavior. But if they're acting unethical, it's your duty to warn them. All right. So an enforceable ethics code for psychologists would be worded broadly enough to be able to ensure that The ethics code is not going to have every single type of act and incident listed. There's just too many. As you learned in the first chapter, through the history, it's surveys that's conducted continuously, and the ethics code is amended accordingly when necessary. And with that being said, we have to just ensure that what language is presented is a guide for us to be able to follow. Not everything is going to always be clear cut. Now, the examples that you'll be utilizing with your lab assignments gives you different scenarios and situations that have actually occurred to be able to help you to start seeing how to use the ethics code as a guide. When you think about a situation, the ethics code is allowing you to take a look and see, okay, can this fall within this particular standard? And sometimes you'll have a situation in which several standards play a part. Okay, so that's why it's written with a broad sense of allowing you to look at it, understand it for what it might be, but know that there is no black or white within this. It's going to have definitely gray intertwinings. Role-specific standards are going to be clearly presented. You'll know what you're supposed to be doing as a psychologist, but those standards that help you not to compromise, like scientific practices or consulting activities, these are the more tangibles that you can grab hold to. But when we're talking about like multiple relationships, or if someone is not enforcing confidentiality appropriately, or knowing about the legal responsibilities, these are some of those things that we have to stop and really delve into the true meaning of it. And that's why you're going to hear me throughout this entire semester talk about consult, consult, consult. When you're not sure, consult. If you don't have a mentor, I suggest you get one. To this day, I still call on my mentor from time to time when I'm not sure of something. Same holds true with utilizing your supervisor. When you're not accustomed to, especially early in your career, you're not going to be accustomed to different situations. And do understand that because of the different orientations that we work from, sometimes we may not recognize how one would work through a situation compared to the other. And so that's why I keep saying consult, consult, consult. But we want to make sure that we understand our roles as well as the context that we work within. And know that it is a diverse role. We wear several hats. You might find yourself as a therapist. You might find yourself in academia as faculty. You might be where you're a director. And each of those different roles, those standards may seem different, but they are still the same. It's just going to be broad and wider for you to have to review. Use of modifiers. Modifiers within the ethics code is going to help in terms of what's going to be deemed to be appropriate, what is potentially feasible for us to utilize and attempt to use. An explanation of the use of those modifiers would be provided within that introduction of the applicability section of the code. So it's going to give you that standard definition. It's going to tell you what aims we're looking for. And then from there, you have to kind of decipher, is it useful for you in this particular situation that you will be in? What would you consider to be reasonable? The term reasonable is looking at it as prevailing professional judgment of psychologists that's going to be engaged in similar activities within similar circumstances, given the knowledge the psychologists have or should have had at the time. Reasonable is that the expectation is that you demonstrate a level of competence before you are starting to act as a psychologist. And that reasonable is used to be able to say that your judgment is that on an objective, professional level. Your activities is going to be in accordance to what those standards are. You're going to be acting through those standards. And at the time, you might find yourself in situations where that gray matter is going to float up to the air, but it's the expectation because of the level of knowledge through your competence of the things that you've learned within this program and through your training, through your supervision, through your consultations, that you're going to be able to act upon everything in a whole. So continuing on talking about what's considered reasonable, the term reasonable will function as where it's prohibited for psychologists from exercising those idiosyncratic ethical judgments that's inconsistent with the values and behaviors of members of the profession. Again, basically what this is saying is don't throw your own belief system into the mix. Here you are to utilize your training, utilize evidence-based theory, utilize the ethics code in making any type of interpretations or judgments especially when you're believed that someone else is being unethical. You want to be fair throughout this whole process, okay? And the expectation of one's conduct not only falls on them, but it also falls on you. You don't want to make any falsehoods. You want to be fair in your determination on whether or not you have to take the step to say this person is being unethical. What is the relevance of specific language that's going to be used within the ethics code in terms of when we're talking about the client, patient, and organizational client? Here, there is interchangeably being combined, and it's saying how those who are psychologists that's providing treatment, any kind of interventions or assessments, they have to follow the ethics code, and it's for the client or patient. It's interchangeable at this point. Still a person who needs help. And when we're talking about organizational clients, here you're looking more about whatever that institution is or representations of those organizations in which you might be providing any kind of consults. You might be providing any type of treatment for them or intervention. Say you're working at a hospital, for example. You are working as a representative of a hospital. If you're at Mississippi State Hospital, for example, that's not your practice. It's actually their practice, and you're working under it. But guess what? There's going to be that fine line that you'll hit once again, because a lot of times, like I told you with Texas Youth Commission, people wanted me to do something that was clearly unethical, but it's going to be considered that expectation because I worked for that facility. So you have to be really careful in terms of looking at how to use the language within the ethics code. So how do we go about making complaints anyway? The APA Ethics Committee, they'll provide rules as well as procedures that's going to give you details about how to enforce the process or start the process. And more or less, you'll be able to find that it's online. I'll probably try to make sure that I add that somewhere for you, in which it's at apa.org/ethics/code and then /committee. And it gives you that process of what they're looking at. But any kind of complaints that you send to the ethics committee can be brought up by not only people who are a part of APA, it could be anyone. It could be a client. It could be a teacher. It could be a student. Anyone have the right to send a complaint to the ethics committee. That complaint is to be dismissed at any time before the ethics committee reviews it, meaning I can yank what I threw in there. But if a case do get to be open, that person who has been opened against, um, they'll receive a letter, and they're given a chance to be able to explain and provide any type of evidence to the allegations, that being to say, and that prove their innocence, so to speak, if they feel that they did not make that violation. Now, in terms of sanctions, what happens when the committee starts to review the material sent to them and the complaint that's being given to them, one or two things is going to happen. They'll either resolve it by saying it's a dismissal, that there was nothing to find to demonstrate any unethical violations, or something else can happen. They might reprimand that psychologist, and reprimand meaning that, you know, it can include saying, well, you're going to have to follow a treatment plan, so to speak, that's going to help to correct the situation and demonstrate that you've done that. They can censor the psychologist, stopping them, like, say, for example, if they're found to be plagiarizing and they wrote an article, and it can stop them from printing and publishing that material. In terms of expulsion, now expulsion can happen a couple of ways. People think automatically about school. Yes, in school, if a student candidate was found to be unethical and it was brought up against to the ethics committee, that student can be expelled from school. But expulsion can also mean loss of your license. It can be presented to your local psychology board, to which a recommendation to revoke your license can be provided. And based off the ethics committee, most psychology boards are going to go into agreement with what the ethics committee present. And they may do their own further investigation, but if it's the recommendation that you lose your license, 9 times out of 10, that's what's going to happen. And that will happen. That's going to be some serious type of violations occurring if it ever came to that point. Stipulated resignation would be that, you know, again, going to ask you to step away from the field. It can be where it's like saying, okay, we're going to suspend you for now until you demonstrate at such time of getting through and clearing up and learning from your mistakes in terms of that violation. So at the time of when the committee is convening and they're looking at it, they can impose different directives to that psychologist to tell them, here's what we need you to do until everything is situated. We might need you to stop doing therapy. We might need you to ask you to stop doing research. We might ask you not to teach any more courses until such time we found out that whether or not you are found to have committed that violation or not. They may ask you, okay, well, until such notice, they'll recommend to the psychology board that you will need to sit and be supervised again. Even though you have a license to practice, at this time, it looks like you are in need of additional supervision as well as more training or education to help alleviate the problem at hand. They may ask you to receive treatment if it's where there's any type of pathological issues that's going on. And they'll want you to be able to agree to some monitoring from the committee. They might assign someone specifically that would be on a probationary situation. And a lot of times that also includes you having additional supervision. That's where that probationary monitoring may happen. Now the committee is going to, after they make their decision, the director of the ethics office itself will provide notification to that psychologist. They'll inform you of what the complainant was, what's the final disposition going to be in the terms of the matter. In terms of APA membership, on an annual basis, they'll look at those people who have been expelled and deem whether or not they should ever be able to get membership back to the APA. Again, although most individuals will be APA members with the ethics committee because they're part of APA, but it's not necessarily so. A person do not have to be a member for the ethics committee to still investigate and provide recommendations. They would then, like I said, send this on to the psychology board where you got your license within that local state. Okay. They will look into informing the APA council about the confidence levels of your competence and provide whether or not they see that whether or not you should still have your license or not, and what type of remedial type of work they would want you to do in order to maintain such licensure. So there may be times when the ethics committee will do what is called a show cause procedure, and pretty much this is where they'll take action against a member if they are currently in a legality issue, having legality issues, and they're in the court already. They might have a problem going on with the licensing board or a state psychological association where there has been some adverse actions already put into place to those entities. Well, the ethics committee can then utilize, because they have, based on these other entities, proof that there might be a problem existing, and they can utilize that and not have to wait for a complaint. Now, as I mentioned before, in terms of the ethics code, not only do APA utilize the ethics code, but there are other parties that will utilize it as well. I mentioned how in terms of state licensing boards, they definitely have adopted it. If mostly all, more than half. I think that number has actually grown to almost everyone. But insurance companies are also utilizing the ethics code and require psychologists, when they are applying for liability insurance, to be following the ethics code as well. And they'll look and check with the ethics committee to see if any complaints have been made upon you in order to determine whether or not they are going to issue insurance to you. So it's a problem if there has been any ethical violations in terms of your pocket, because if you have been found to have committed any type of ethical violations, insurance companies will charge more money to your premium, and sometimes they just straight out deny you, so you have to really be careful of that as well. So how is the APA ethics code related to law? In terms of civil litigation, understand that we try to abide by our laws, and it's not necessarily that the ethics code is strictly geared toward the law, but intended to be more of a guide to keeping us within the law, if that makes sense for you. Realize though, as it's stating on the slide, any type of compliance with or any type of violation of the ethics code, it might actually be used as evidence in legal proceedings depending on what type of circumstance. That being if the damage done to a client actually was detrimental to the point of doing harm to that client. The client might not only just sue you, but the client might actually press charges against you. I think about in terms of the ethics code, and when we talked about duty to warn, a couple of years ago, it was where in California, where the young man was unfortunately became an active shooter, and they pressed charges against the psychologist that was treating him because they felt that he did not warn law enforcement in a timely manner that could have prevented the situation. Now, did the psychologist follow procedures to what he felt? He felt he did. He informed the family and attempted to retrieve the young man, but before they can locate him and find him, unfortunately, he did wind up killing several people. So that's what I'm speaking about in terms of there's times where our ethics code might be used as a source of evidence or the lack thereof in terms of whether or not a psychologist was performing within their ethical duties. So some of the standards that we have to comply with in terms of with the law is when we're talking about work-related discrimination. We're not to discriminate against others, be that their gender, their race, their social economic status. That's something that is within the law. When we're trying to get consent for minors, that's another issue that we have to look at the legal ramifications of, and there are some times where you are it's important for you to make sure that you keep the parents in the loop for a minor, for example, or how you do that. When we're getting consent for treatment, do know that we have to get consent for a minor, but you also should get assent from the minor, okay? And then we look at any type of other confidential information that we have to make sure that we protect at all costs. And now in terms of the legalities, there's going to be times when you are asked to break confidentiality. And as you know already, in terms of when we're looking at vulnerable adults and child abuse, that we are mandated reporters. So not only do we have to oblige the ethics code and follow those standards, but that is also a law within the local state government. These are the type of things that will show a correlation with the ethics code and how we will comply with the law in those different types of situations. We also know that, law is not going to really dictate how the ethic code is. There's no specific standards that's been created because of a law, or like for criminal conviction, for example. There's no specific violation that's been created for that. But do remember, ABA can take any type of action against a member who may be convicted of any kind of felony, as well as working toward that expulsion or removal of licensure. So we also have to be in compliance in terms how we maintain our documentation. That be how we create it, how we store it, how we dispose of records. You can look up standard 6.01 that would help explain that further. But know that, for example, we are mandated to maintain our records on our clients for a period of at least 7 years. Yeah, 7 years. It went up from 5 to 7. How we create it, we have to be sure that we are storing and keeping this material confidential so that we are protecting our client at all costs. In terms of how we dispose of records, we can't just simply toss it in the trash. It has to be shredded, destroyed, to the point where no one else can come back and see that Jane Doe was a client of ours. In terms of fees and practices, we do have compliance in terms of how we present those fees. We can't deny a client, for example, services because they hadn't paid fees, particularly if there's a emergency situation. We can, though, send it to collections. That can be done. We have to also consider animals in research, as well as looking at contractual type obligations. These are some of the areas in which our compliance with law and standards and the ethical standards, they might have some overlap and intertwine with one another. Now, I mentioned to you my time in Texas Youth Connection, and understand you will more than likely find yourself within conflicts between the ethics and the law, regulations, as well as other governing legal authority. I call it that red tape. There's going to be times when you'll want to ensure services for a client, but there's situations that would prevent the client from receiving those services based on the organization's mandates and rules. But as far as for us, in terms of the applicability section, we have to comply with the ethics code first, because it's the higher standard that is required by law. And when the ethical standard is in direct conflict with legal authorities, then you have to at least make every effort to commit to the ethics code to help resolve the conflict. So what's an example of that? Suppose you were subpoenaed to go to court and testify against your client. Are you going to immediately give all the information? Well, then you would be immediately breaking confidentiality. You should first and foremost try in every attempt to protect your client. Now, does that mean that you'll take the fifth and never say another thing and then wind up in contempt of court? No. But how you can protect your client is going to be based upon how you document your situations, what you are sharing when you share your files, because they're going to want to see your files. But it's not something, they have to provide you with a warrant. They have to provide that subpoena. It can't be something just where a person come in and asks, well, I want this and please give it to me. You can't even acknowledge whether or not you're seeing the client. By acknowledging that you have that client, guess what? You broke confidentiality. But you need to take every purposeful step to protect your client, and only when you've exhausted every option, if it's where you still have to testify, then of course you have to follow the law at that point and testify. But again, the important part is making the appropriate steps. This reminds me of a situation, and this is not about a psychologist, but it was actually a nurse. And I saw this video, and I think this video actually been out for a couple of years. But this poor woman, she was a nurse doing her job, was arrested for refusing to give a blood sample to the police when they requested it. She expressed that they did not have a warrant. She did not have permission from the patient, and therefore wasn't allowed to provide them with a blood sample. Well, the police officer, he got upset and arrested her. I just saw this last week, but I know that this was something that happened a couple of years ago. But that's kind of an example of what can happen and how it's being entangled in that web of trying to be lawful but also ethical. Okay, in every aspect here, he did not present her with a warrant. He did not present her with a subpoena. So by all rights, she followed her ethical code of saying, no, I cannot do that. I cannot help you with this. I'm sorry. I do not have any permissions from any patients with that name, so on and so forth. I do not see any type of documentation saying that I have to give you this. So therefore, unfortunately, by my job and my standards, I'm not allowed to. There can be situations that you might fall within that same type of category. Again, when that ethical standard is a direct conflict of the governing legal authority, psychologists must make a knowledgeable commitment to the ethics code first, and try to create steps of resolution to the conflict, not just hand everything over, because that's not truly resolving it. That's just breaking confidentiality in that particular case. Okay, so if you are not able to resolve the situation, then again, like I mentioned, you're going to follow the legal requirements only when that adherence is justifiable and it defends any kind of violations of human rights. So again, our duty is not to harm our clients, but when you're not able to resolve the situation, like a subpoena or having to testify, you're going to make every effort to provide the courts with what they're expecting, and just that. You're not going to spill and give them the whole life history and everything and anything that you've heard from this client. You'll stick to the facts. All right. So now we're moving from talking about how things are applicable to now looking at general principles. Our moral value systems that's interwoven with the APA ethical standards has created what we call the 5 general principles. And these principles, again, you heard me mention earlier in the lecture how we aspire to do well and aspire to be at our best. Well, these principles help to give us that aspiration, as well as keep us up to the level that we should be as psychologists. Principle A, beneficence and non-maleficence. This is that first principle that gives us that double hat, so to speak, in which we work first and foremost to do good and avoid doing any harm to our clientele. You can think of it like this. There's moral responsibility that's attached to this, and that's why they kind of added this in terms of our aspirational facets to ourselves, in that we hope a person would want, if you're in this field, meaning you want to help people and that you want to do good by the people that you're working for. So we work toward, we don't want to be malicious, we don't want to be hurtful. We're always working toward protecting those we serve, more or less. Okay? And our belief systems, our value systems, the work we do, our level of confidence, all is wrapped up within that circle. How we treat our clients. If you are not confident in a particular area, then you shouldn't be working with that client within that area. If you don't consider yourself well trained, say for example, we were talking about in the learning and cognition course the different orientations that we're in. Now mine again is psychodynamics, but if I hadn't had any type of training in cognitive behavioral or any type of behavior therapies, then I would not want to be able to infuse any type of techniques that's involved with cognitive behavioral theory, because that's not what I'm a professional in or an expert in. You need to have your level of competence and your training intact. When you don't, then that's when you got non-maleficence going on, because you are going to be a harm to your clients. All right, the next thing, which kind of piggybacks off of what I've just talked about, all of these you'll find that there's an overlap somewhat. But fidelity and responsibility, that's principle B. A faithfulness in that you're going to respect and treat others the same way you would want to be treated. Okay? We keep the promise that we will accept any type of fiduciary responsibilities, that we will protect as far as maintenance in terms of our documentation, how we're doing therapy and treatments and interventions, that they're going to be of scientific level, evidence-based, that we will always remain professional, and that when we're having a teaching relationship like you and I right now, that I'm going to provide you with the most recent, most updated, most current information as possible, and I'm going to convey and relay it to you in a way that you will be able to take it and utilize it and apply it. That's my responsibility. And if I'm not doing well at it, and I think I'm saying it as being an imposter, some people have an imposter complex going on. But if I felt that I didn't know what my job well enough to share this information and pass it forward to you, then I'm not following responsibility. I'm not following principle B. my fealty would not be to psychology, so to speak. So we have to be able to meet our responsibilities by avoiding any kind of conflicts of interest. If I'm doing research, for example, and I'm doing research on a particular drug, I'm not going to want to work to say allow the pharmaceutical company to tell me how to do it, because that's a conflict of interest, right? I also want to make sure that if I'm providing interventions, that I am not exploiting others, like with multiple relationships, that I'm not attempting to do any harm. I'm not trying to ignore any situations. I'm following protocol. I'm being a professional and doing everything that is necessary for me to make sure that I do no harm to the client. Bottom line, Principle C is talking about one's integrity, how we are to be honest, being able to communicate, trying to keep promises. And one thing, let me say about keeping promises. One, if you cannot deliver, do not promise your client something when you know you can't. When a client is in mourning, for example, they're grieving, you cannot automatically say, I know it's going to be all right. How do you know that? In reality, you're giving them a promise that you can't keep. So you want to make sure that you state things that is factual and that you can actually come through with. You want to be accurate in the science in terms of when you're doing research. Your research, you don't want to gear it to do what you would like it to do. You want to gear it to be able to answer the hypothesis. If it's where it's going to be accurate, or it can be a no, but you can't try to dictate how the research is going to go. That, when you do that, your integrity has been shaken, okay? You're going to want to be, now we all know there's going to be times, particularly when we're talking about research, that deception may be required. But we also know that if you utilize deception within your research, what happens? Once you are at the point where you've collected the data, you have to immediately debrief your client or participant. Always think about the welfare of those who's sitting before you. Always think about how the things you do, if you don't do them correctly, can actually be detrimental to their mental health. And that's just the simplest way that I can say, utilizing your moral standards as well as following the principle of integrity, Principle C. All right. We believe in justice for all. We also know that justice doesn't come for all. There are times when individuals push the buttons and push the gambit. We've recently seen that in terms of law enforcement. For psychologists, we have to strive and make sure that we're fair with others, that we see people as equals, that we provide them with the access to treatment as well as benefits of scientific knowledge, utilizing what we have learned through evidence-based theories and making sure that it's something that works for that client. Like we mentioned before, sometimes it's not about a cookie-cutter approach. Sometimes we have to create interventions and treatment plans that's going to be specifically useful for that client. When we do that, then we're justified in how we're treating our clients, and we can demonstrate it all day long. That's part of justice. This also is talking about how we have to follow procedures and services that's going to help meet those needs with whom we're working with. And being able to recognize the social and economic inequalities that can impact and affect our clients' livelihood, their well-being. We have to keep those all in mind as well. If we know that clients, we know that there's health disparities in terms of health and mental health, we know that there's disparities all day long. We also know that we should be striving to be able to make sure that we can provide for others. And for the life of me, I can't believe I forgot the last APA president's name. It'll probably come to me after this lecture. But her goal, Davis, I believe her last name was Davis. I believe it was Davis. Don't hold me to it. Right now my mind is mush with the names. But her goal was to have APA and its members focus on a social economic status in terms of being able to look and see how poverty has stricken and has created problems in terms of mental health. And the goal was to work through those poverty lines and getting past that in order to make sure that we're supplying and providing the help people need even when they can't afford it. That's what we're calling justice, being able to be active agents of change. Principle E is talking about respect of people's rights and dignity. And, you know, a lot of times people saying, well, okay, that's a no-brainer. Why do we even have to go over this? We go over this because it's important to reiterate how we have to respect those we work around. We respect people's privacy. We understand the concept of confidentiality, and we should utilize that. One thing I want to point out, when you're doing presentations about your client, so just like I discussed with my client, I gave enough for you to understand the situation, but not enough for you to pick through it and figure out who I was speaking about. It's important that we do not provide any identifiable information to our clients. Same holds true when you're doing research. You're going to want to make sure that when you're collecting data, none of that data can actually pinpoint who your participants was. We have to ensure confidentiality throughout. Self-determination is your aspiration of making sure that you can do your job correctly, that you're determined to be able to follow the ethics code, you're determined to be able to maintain confidentiality of your clients, you're determined to ensure that there's no harm being done to your clients. Okay? So some of these standards I want you to make sure you have a good understanding about, make sure you read them to where you kind of get a good feel, is in the standards that's listed here of 310, 8.02, 9.03, 10.01, in which it covers informed consent and confidentiality. We also look about those individual differences and demonstrating respect toward others, 2.01, 3.01, and 9.01. And then, of course, more about privacy and confidentiality, looking at standards 6.02, 7.04, and 10.03. And of course, there's going to be others that have similar things that we have to look at in terms of providing respect and dignity to the people we work for or service. So this concludes Chapter 2 on the Ethics Code. I will be, there is the lab assignments. Please make sure that you are doing those. I know last week I had assigned you to do lab assignment number 1. Please, let's get them done prior to the next week. So you now have lab assignment 2 as well as 1, because I noticed prior to me doing this lecture that no one completed lab assignment 1. So I'm asking you, please make sure you get those done, as a week has now gone by. So I will talk with you soon, and please go ahead and get started with Chapter 3. Be sure that you're also reviewing the ethics code and utilizing, when you answer those questions, what I want you to think about in the lab assignments, which standards would you utilize for the different vignettes that I have for you in the lab assignments. On that note, have a great week and talk with you soon.